Good evening and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Ann Collins Goodyear, co-director of the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. It's a pleasure to welcome you this evening for a presentation by L.J. Roberts, the 2023 to 2024 Halley K. Harrisburg 90 and Michael Rosenfeld Artist-in-Residence. We are deeply grateful to Halley and Michael, who are with us this evening, for making possible this important program in which LJ is the 7th participant. Dedicated to illuminating oft erased and unacknowledged queer and trans histories, LJ has consistently used their work to shine light on heroic individuals and important places and spaces. With deftness and deliberation, LJ has worked across many different media, including large-scale textile installations, intricate embroideries, artist books, collages, and mixed media sculptures. Tracing complex webs of interconnections, personal and geographical, LJ builds conceptual and physical maps of queer life of the past, present, and future through material deviance and reimagining craft practices. LJ's path-breaking work has been widely exhibited by an international array of institutions that includes the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C., the Victoria and Albert in London, and the Bowdoin College Museum of Art in Brunswick. Their work has been widely collected by other leading museums, such as the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, the Brooklyn Museum, and the Oakland Museum of American Art. During their time at Bowdoin, LJ has been extremely productive, connecting in meaningful ways with students, staff, and faculty across campus. We are grateful to Natalie Turin, director of the Sexuality, Women, and Gender Center, for organizing last fall an art-making workshop with LJ in support of visual aids. We thank Professors Jackie Brown and Mike Colster in the Department of Visual Arts for generously providing studio support, and Professors Carrie Skanga and Bethany Engstrom for welcoming LJ to their classes. We also thank Colleen Kinsella and Lori Holland for their support. For assistance provided to LJ on digital mapping and 3D printing, I also want to acknowledge and thank our colleagues in academic computing, including especially David Israel, Jennifer Snow, and Aaron Gilbreth. And at the Museum of Art, I offer a special thanks to my colleagues Amanda Skinner, Casey Braun, Sabrina Lynn, and Anthony Filipponi for all they have done in support of LJ's residency. Perhaps most important, however, it has been the incredible engagement and enthusiasm of Bowdoin students who have taken great advantage of the many opportunities for connection with LJ during their residency, for all they have done to organize lunches and studio visits with LJ. I want to thank, in particular, Emily Jacobs, Andrew Tran, Alex Spear, and Abby Wong. Finally, I wish to share our heartfelt appreciation with LJ Roberts for their remarkable generosity to our community. Having had the opportunity to exhibit LJ's work here at the BCMA almost 8 years ago, it has been a special pleasure to have them back on campus, sharing their extraordinary work and professional experience, and inviting students, faculty, and staff to spend time in their studio and to be part of their creative process. And now, please join me in welcoming LJ Roberts.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah. I have a clicker tonight, so I'm sure I'll screw that up sooner or later. I just want to say thank you so much for having me. I think this is my 4th trip up to Bowdoin over the years and my third trip during the school year. And I've just had a really wonderful, productive, and energizing time here. And I really want to thank Hallie and Michael for making this possible for me. It has been incredibly helpful to the body of work I'm making right now. And being in this community and getting, actually, I really value student feedback a lot, has been fantastic. So it's great to see the students who have come to my studio and knit with me and heard me talk about my project and given me feedback here in the audience. And big thank you to Anne and Frank, who have been in touch with me now for what, like over 10 years, I guess we've been working together. And seem to embrace a lot of my very off-kilter ideas that feels incredibly validating when I'm unsure of what I'm doing. So, and also Amanda for all the arrangements that have been made to have me up here. It's just been a really lovely time. Even through the challenging times that Maine has had, I've always felt very supported here. And I haven't been teaching this year, so it was really nice to be back on a campus. But, so we'll start. And I start with this picture, which is a picture of the Names Project AIDS Memorial quilt laid out for the last time in full in Washington, D.C. And I was actually, my partner is here also, which is also nerve-wracking because I get all kinds of feedback after these lectures. But I was saying this morning, you know, I do a lot of visiting artist talks and I really like doing them. And it's a real honor for me, but so much of my art is very intertwined with my life. I'm an artist that works very much from my own experience in the world, which has been one of, you know, weathering kind of cultural changes. I was born in 1980, so just for all the students here, I grew up without the internet. So if you can like imagine what that was like, it was in certain ways, I think, easier, and in certain ways, it was like trying to navigate in the dark on certain things. And one of those things was gender and sexuality. I grew up outside of Detroit. I come from a very, very conservative area. I have a very, I guess, heteronormative family, to say the least. And it was very difficult for me to grow up there as someone who was incredibly conspicuously different in a lot of ways, but particularly in terms of kind of my gender and my attitude. And I left home when I was actually 13, and I ended up, after bouncing around a little bit, at a boarding school in Baltimore, Maryland, that was an all-girls Episcopal school. So you can imagine for like a queer Jewish kid, that was a strange environment to be in. And there was a field trip that they were taking to go see the Names Project AIDS Memorial quilt laid out for the last time in full in Washington, D.C. And that was in 1995, so I was about 15. And it took me 2 weeks to put my name on that list because it terrified me, because I was very nervous about my gender and sexuality. But there was also no vocabulary for it. Where I grew up, you had no words, and you had no pictures, and you had no representation. So I knew that there was something, but I didn't know exactly what it was. So after 2 weeks, I finally put my name on this field trip list, and I was the only person that signed up. And I went with a chaperone to Washington, D.C., and walked around the AIDS Memorial quilt for hours. And of course, it was incredibly impactful because of how far-reaching and how devastating the AIDS epidemic was and still is, because AIDS is not over. And it was also very enlightening for me because it was the first time I had ever seen words or pictures or illustrations, you know, filled with love and grief, but having to do with gender and sexuality. So I was getting this kind of lexicon of things that I had been feeling but had not been able to verbalize or that were illegible to me. So it was a very formative time. And then I guess the other background to give you is that My family are Jewish refugees from mostly Ukraine, Russia, and Lithuania, and Germany and Poland. My great-grandmother supported the family after immigrating from Ukraine in 1920 as a seamstress. She was the breadwinner. And she taught my grandmother all of her skills. My grandmother was a fabulous artist. She could do anything in textiles, but was also an abstract and figurative painter. And at 6 years old or 7 years old, she taught me how to knit. And I absolutely hated it. I was like, this is like the worst, why are you making me do this on the weekends? And she would teach me to embroider, and she was like, this is how you make lace. And I was like, you're driving me crazy, can I watch cartoons? But she taught me how to knit, and it skipped my mother, who will take her clothing to a dry cleaner to get a button sewn back on. So there was like this very typical immigrant story where like the second generation doesn't want anything to do with anything. But I learned, and then I ended up going to the University of Vermont after having a very rough high school experience, which we'll skip over. But I, again, was like, okay, I have to deal with this gender and sexuality thing because my junior senior year, there was no way I was able to be out. I had been kicked out of school and taken to one of those very scary therapeutic boarding schools that you now see on Netflix very recently. So I went to Vermont being like, okay, they're hippies and they'll accept me and I can write a lot. I ended up at UVM, and I was a critical literary studies major and poetry. So I was really interested in language and words. And then finally, I was like, okay, I can deal with the gender and sexuality. I came out, and I started getting really interested again in the AIDS epidemic. I was very active in a queer and trans political group that was called Free to Be, but we did things called like bringing free HIV testing to campus. We did an event called Condoms and Cupcakes. We started the first free queer, or it was called Translating Identity, so it was a conference on trans issues. And I also started, I was living with a bunch of Earth First activists in a radical environmental co-op, and I started going with them to their guerrilla actions where they would lock themselves to Staples shelves with bicycle locks to protest forest deforestation, and would climb towers to hang banners. So between learning all of those skills and being very interested in activism of ACT UP, but also art made by affiliate groups like Grand Fury or Fierce Pussy or House of Color, I was like, I want to learn how to do this, and I think I'm going to do it in a way that reflects this kind of interest in art and activism. And I was taking sculpture classes, I injured myself, I picked up knitting again, and I ended up, I guess, telling my mother I was queer by hanging this giant knitted banner that says "Mom knows now" off the highest building in Vermont. Because how else would you tell your mother that you were gay? I'm still that same kid. I'm so bad. But so this was one of the pieces. I actually made this my junior year of undergrad. And I had a friend who had a key to every building at the University of Vermont because he was president of the school, and you got one of those. So we snuck up at the tower and dropped this circa like 2002 at UVM. And I thought it was pretty cool to climb buildings, and so I kept doing it. Which brings us to California College of Arts and Crafts. I decided on a whim to apply to grad school. I was interested in learning more about textiles now that I had kind of picked it up again to make sculpture. I found that I was very interested in writing still, so I was kind of using material to write off the page. And I found that a lot of the issues that I was interested in when I was studying critical literary theory and poetry, I could actually emphasize that meaning by embodying it with material. And so I almost consider myself a writer more than an artist sometimes, but someone who just writes with material. and very dysfunctionally, and like I said, very deviantly. But I went to CCAC, and I started school there, and a letter was sent out maybe the first 2 weeks we were there. I was 24, and it said, we're dropping the word crafts off of our name. And people had a lot of reactions to that because CCAC was born out of the arts and crafts movement. The making that happens there is really deliberate and exquisite and conceptual. The craft departments have historically been really robust. And I thought about why the word craft would be dropped. Like, what's wrong with this word? And lots of museums around the country were also dropping it. And I was like, craft is a lot like queer, where, you know, it's signaling non-normativity, but you can't really tell what that non-normativity is because it encompasses so many different kinds of groups. So, you know, if you're queer, it can include your sexuality, your race, your gender, your class. And craft had a lot of that stigma also in it. So I was interested in thinking about those parallels. So a lot of my work in grad school had to do with that and how craft could reflect a queer experience. And so the morning of Open Studios, my first year, I decided that I would take the tallest ladder I could find, and I snuck it out at 6 in the morning with 2 very close friends, and I had knitted the word crafts in bright orange yarn, put it over plexiglass, and I stuck it on there with E6000 glue, which, if you know what that is, it's not coming down. And so everyone arrived to Open Studios at CCA, which is a very big deal, and saw this thing and absolutely lost their minds. And, and most people viewed it very positively because they were very attached to the name. People were actually wearing a shirt that said CCAC, the C is silent. And the great story about this is that I did not know that the promotional video for the school was being filmed the next day. So communications was unhappy, but it's an art school. Like, what are they gonna do? They can't tell me to take it down. So it actually stayed up there for a week until the grad department begged me to take it down because they were getting a lot of grief from the administration. And, but it's now actually in the Oakland Museum of California, and there's a documentation and an oral history along with the letters, some of which had to be recreated because when the E6000, I couldn't get them off and I had to break them off. So, so you can see it's always on display. It's on permanent display. And this was my MFA thesis project. I don't want to talk too much about it, but one of the things that I've been told a lot over my career is that I make work too slowly, which I now just embrace. But actually, it's kind of a problem in our household right now. But I was told, I had a great graduate advisor who looked at me and was like, I found this toy on the internet called the Cool Quarter, and you can turn it and it makes knitted tubes. And I looked at her like she had 5 heads and was like, I'm not using a toy to make my work. And I went to my next meeting and she said, I bought this for you. You need to try it. It's for ages 8 and up. And it's pink and sparkly, and I was addicted immediately. And so a lot of my work is made using children's toy knitting machines. In fact, I bought a new vintage Barbie knitting machine off eBay today. So a lot of my work is actually made on the Cool Quarter still, and the Barbie knitting machine, and the sock making machines, which I did with the students when I was in residence here. So this piece is entirely made on these toy knitting machines. It's a 30-foot long fence. It's 10 feet tall. And after my thesis show, it was pretty much shown for 10 years continuously in different shows across the country. But just to say that like one little thing can change your whole practice, which it did. Which brings us to this piece. And after grad school, I moved to New York. And when I got to New York, there was this really amazing period of time where there were a lot of queer collective houses that had sprouted up, meaning that like queer and trans people were living together in houses in many different kinds of formations and many different kinds of ways. But there was a little bit of a grassroots feeling of them organizing events and workshops within their houses. And it was kind of just a time where things felt like they were flourishing. And a friend of mine, Rosa Lang-Levitsky, drew this really beautiful map of all the queer collective houses in Brooklyn. And I was obsessed with this map. I love maps, and I love geography. So I was obsessed with this map, and it had all the names of the queer houses and where they were at. And the story with this piece is that I was living in Richmond, Virginia for a fellowship at Virginia Commonwealth University, and the National Portrait Gallery had just censored a piece by David Wojnarowicz called Fire in My Belly. And I was really upset about that, so I wrote a lot of letters, and I marched, and I got an email in my inbox one day from the Smithsonian, and I figured it was just, hi, thank you for your letter. But instead it was asking me for a portfolio. And they were doing a show at the Renwick called 40 Under 40 Craft Futures, and I was 30. So I was a little younger than I am now, even though I don't look it. So, I actually met with the curators and said, I really want to make this piece for you, but it's going to have explicit imagery, and I need you to stand up for me. And they said, absolutely, we'll stand up for you. And they were upset about the decision. So I ended up knitting on my toy knitting machines this map that Rosa drew, the queer houses of Brooklyn and the three towns of Brooklyn, Midwood, and Boswick during the 41st year of the Stonewall era. And each triangle has a button on it, like kind of the punk buttons you get, that has the name of the house and an illustration that represents the house. So as you can see, there's like Glitter House is a unicorn. That's where Rosa lived. Den of Sin had to be a leather daddy devil. Handsome Transom was a houseboat on the Gowanus that actually ran aground in Hurricane Sandy and was sadly destroyed. So this piece actually is still at the Renwick, but one of the things that characterizes a lot of my practice is that when pieces go into an institution or museum, I also like them to go out. So these buttons are free and available to take to the public. They function a lot like a Felix Gonzalez Torres piece, who is in a lot of my work. Actually, he's literally in a work that you'll see. His pieces, a part of his work is literally in another piece of work that will come later. So these buttons are constantly put out in front of the piece, and people can take them and put them on their shirt or backpack. That piece is now resting for 3 to 5 years, but it's been on display a lot, and it's been kind of the foundation for my work that I've made in the past, I guess now 14 years later. Which brings us to community vans. So an extension off of that project, and I'm talking a little out of order now, but I think this project is interesting to talk about in terms of the queer houses. I had a couple of friends who actually had vans, which also had names, pictured on this zine, Vanifesto, a meditation on van lust by my friend Hadassah Deluxe, is the van Kraline Dream. There's also another van that existed, was the Trojan Pony. And it was all about these kind of conversion vans that were used within this kind of queer community in Brooklyn, or multiple communities, that would pick you up at midnight and pack the van with different people and take you to the queer beach in New York, which is called Reese Beach. Or they would haul your performance troupe around the country, or they would take you down to the Queer Land Project in Tennessee. And they become kind of these rolling, I guess, places of culture and kinship. And I just love this scene. It was kind of like, I'm from Detroit, so I'm a car freak, a vehicle freak, and a boat freak. And I really liked thinking about this kind of landlessness and nomad life in vans. I was also really interested in bringing together the past, present, and future using queered fiber practices. So we could talk about the history of fibers forever, and I love having that conversation, but I won't have it now. But I'm interested in that in an art historical way and in kind of a queer legacy way. I was wrestling and remixing lesbian, trans, and gender nonconforming legacies. I'm always into the possibilities and problematics of queer alternative kinship, nomadism, landlessness, movement, and identity. And I was dealing with a lot of post-apocalypse anxiety through like trying to deal with my anxiety through imagination by reading a lot of speculative fiction. So I'd been binge watching this great film, Born in Flames by Lizzie Borden. Highly recommended if you haven't seen it. Reading Parable of the Sower and watching Stranger Things, which has a van in the second season that goes back and forth in time. And also just exploring my roots I'm actually a 5th generation Detroiter. I wrote 3rd on here, but my father has corrected me. And trying to like loosen up and have some fun with my work. So I got very interested in van culture. This is a van that was in Slab City in California. These are my dogs when we were van camping in Lompoc, California. They appear in a lot of my work. This was the first sketch I made of this piece that ended up being this giant quilt. This is in process. It was a show at Museum of Arts and Design where they actually moved my entire studio into half of the 3rd floor of the Museum of Arts and Design, which I shared with the artist Sarah Zapata. I can kind of explain what's going on, but you can kind of see the outline of the van, and then there are these knitted tubes around it, but this is in process. And this is how the piece ended up. It's about, I think it's something like 14 feet tall and 22 feet long. It's literally a mural. It's absolutely mammoth. So it takes like 2 cherry pickers and 8 really burly art handlers to put up. But again, it's like made on all of the toy knitting machines. These are some details. Hacked light brights are the tail lights. The words are all made of shoelaces. So again, thinking about like movement and things that we wear. I'm very interested in language, as I always have been. So the van has its own van language. So for instance, there's van date, vaniversary, vampire. My favorite is vantankerous, over the gas tank. So this took about 6 years to make. I use a lot of like reclaimed things. So these were zippers that I found at Materials for the Arts that make up the fenders. The tires that you see on there are all busted bike inner tubes. So yeah, it's a lot of different kinds of fabrics all combined. A 6-year process of dragging this thing. This thing was on my car roof that I drove it across country. I worked on it in the open desert. It's seen a lot. This is an archive vitrine at the Museum of Arts and Design that combines a lot of the van research along with the fibers research. And then, this is skipping back in time a little bit, but affording a studio in New York City is very difficult. And I was in a place when I came back from Virginia on my fellowship where I was like, affording a studio is not possible. And how do I make work without a studio? And I had taught myself how to embroider when I was at VCU and was like, you know, maybe I'll start making portraits of my friends. And it was something that I can do anywhere. So the top photo is me in Sweden before Pride, stitching on a bench. Obviously I'm on the subway stitching and then camping. I bring an embroidery wherever I go so I can always work. And I started making portraits. This is my friend Ted Kerr. He's at the ACT UP 25th anniversary protest on Wall Street. I take really fast photos on my iPhone, but I've always also had a photography practice, which a lot of people don't know. And I also show the backs of the embroideries. And I never ever wanted to make portraiture. It felt like everything I didn't want art to be. There are certain times I love portraiture, but as someone who has had a body that has been so antagonized and still watches like trans and queer bodies under such attack, I was like, I just want to escape this. I want to have my art not be about the body. And so that's where you see like a lot of words and structures. And now I'm making these portraits. And I felt like, I thought back to, when was the first time I actually saw queer people pictured? Because I had read about queer people starting when I was 14, a little bit in books by Toni Morrison. I think Sula has this like really great scene that is incredible, and reading authors like Dorothy Allison and June Jordan. But I actually think the first time I really saw queer people was like in the work of Catherine Opie. And I said, well, maybe I should start making representations because it's really important to see ourselves. And I also want to picture the people that are in my community, knowing that portraiture is always excluding people, and I wrestle with that. But I also show the other side. And so at the same time that the figurative exists, the abstract exists, and they're the same piece. And I really like the way that showing both sides collapses the binary between figurative work and abstract work because they are one and the same. A lot of people in these pictures are my collaborators. This is my friend Chris, who I made a film with him and Ted, and an embroidery of my friend Nick Naz, who you'll see in a little bit. So I made, this is Alex Fiallo and Esther McGowan, a visual aid, standing in front of a Zoe Leonard piece that a lot of people know on the High Line. This was a really painful piece to make because it was after the 2016 election, and that text took me 6 months. But in this series, it's called Carry With Me 10 Years of Portraits, and there's 26 portraits total. This is Rosa, who drew the Queer House map. This piece is up at the Barbican right now, if you're going to London. This is one of my favorite backs, too. The Barbican put it on a postcard, and I was really excited to have my first museum postcard because I used to love museum postcards and put them up in my room. So I'm really happy that they got the humor of, you know, God Save the Queen and put it on a postcard, and I sent them to all my friends in the States when I was there in February. My friend Nick Naz, who's an experimental filmmaker, but is now making lots of money working for Netflix and other big productions. Frederick Weston, who was one of my closest friends. He passed away in 2020, but fantastic, fantastic artist. We marched together with visual aids and pride, chained to each other. But I really love this embroidery, and this is also at the Barbican right now. My friend Sarah Zapata, who's also in that show. This is her studio with some of her weaving. Vivian Crockett, curator. This is the site of St. Vincent's Hospital, which is now townhouses. And this was an installation shot of the project. This was at an organization in Brooklyn called Pioneer Works. I had a really great residency at Pioneer Works, which is down the street from my old apartment in Brooklyn. And that residency was really generative. It was a great community of people, but they really like to give residents shows. And I saw this gallery, and I was like, this is the gallery where these 26 portraits go. And so they are installed chronologically by when the embroideries were done. The frames get hinged to the wall, and then you can actually go and turn the frame to see the back. So it actually works like a book. Again, like lots of literary influence coming into the work. But I loved how small and intimate this gallery was, and I had had this vision for about 10 years to have all of these portraits together. You know, I carry them around in a tote bag. Usually they take about 6 months to a year to make. So it's like getting to bring your friends with you wherever you go, which is really lovely. And then putting them all together was a really moving experience for me and actually a lot of my friends. It was a really fun opening. And this is a detail of how they're installed. And then that's what the back looks like. And then I made my first book. It works exactly the same as the portraits. So you see the recto, and then you turn it and you see the verso of the piece. And I did a bunch of writing about each of the embroideries. Writing a book is kind of hellish, to be honest, but really hellish. But I really love the book, actually, and I'm able to look at it again after the process of writing. But it has essays by some of my favorite people, including Ted, Kerr and Sir Rodney Sir, who's a really wonderful art luminary in New York City, and two of my grad school professors. One is an art historian, and the other is an artist, and then Carmen Ermo, who's a curator at the Brooklyn Museum. And then I feel like it's really important to include collaborative projects that I do, because I don't only work in textiles, I work in a lot of different ways. But this is one of my most favorite projects. I was in a show at the Brooklyn Museum called Agitprop, and I was allowed to kind of come up with a project that I wanted to do. And I decided to collaborate with visual aids. They do a project called Play Smart, where they give out packets of, they're kind of like baseball cards, but there's about 4 cards in a pack, and they kind of have a pin up on the front and then facts about AIDS and HIV on the back. And the first 4 versions they did were men. And then I think they did a version that were trans men, and then they did a craft version. And I was kind of like, yeah, you might need to put some women in there because women also live with HIV, you know? And they were like, oh yeah, let's do a packet with women. So I gathered up a bunch of friends and collaborators and colleagues. That's Tourmaline. I'm sure a lot of people know her work, and Keila Beja, who's an incredible photographer and performance artist. Serena, who's a firefighter, people from all different kind of facets of community. And we decided to make a packet of people who self-identify as women from all different kinds of backgrounds, some HIV positive, some not. Every age group from 20, there were participants from in their 20s to their 60s, and every decade in between, everyone got paid. And these packets also, they come with a condom, a package of lubrication, and we also have an internal condom in this one. And they were given out at the Brooklyn Museum. So again, you know, having work that goes into the institution and exits the institution and circulates into the world. It was funny, at dinner we were talking about these like quiet moments that artists sometimes have and how they're really important. And in, I guess it was like 2014, I was having a quiet moment where like things had kind of slowed down and I wasn't totally sure what I was doing. And I ended up moving out to the Mojave Desert in North Joshua Tree with my partner for her to finish school. And I had a task for Vice magazine of all publications. And if you know Vice magazine, like sometimes they swing extra far left and sometimes they're extra far right. But Avram Finkelstein, who was part of Grand Fury and the Silence Equals Death Collective, and who was a fantastic artist, and Hugh Ryan, who wrote a book called When Brooklyn Was Queer, were curating a project where they asked artists to come up with a monument for Stonewall. There was a movie that came out that was called Stonewall. I don't think anyone saw it, and if you did, I'm really sorry. But it basically positioned cis white gay men as being responsible for the Stonewall uprising, and a lot of people had problems with this. So they asked us to redesign, like, what would a Stonewall monument look like? And there is one there by George Siegel, but after that movie came out, they were dressed as trans women of color and like a radical guerrilla act. So it was like, that was the prompt. Like, if we're gonna do a Stonewall monument, what does it look like? And this happened actually right before a lot of monuments surrounding civil rights and racial injustice and slavery came down in the United States, where we saw statues of Robert E. Lee come down and other people in history who have caused great acts of violence. So it actually preceded it a little bit, which is always kind of interesting to think about. But I was working on the project, and while I was working on the project, President Obama decided to make Stonewall a national monument itself, like the whole bar, which is really funny because Stonewall is like kind of what used to be a really nasty bar. And also it was like a site of a lot of police brutality. So all these articles came out in the New York Times, and I'm a really obsessive New York Times reader. constantly looking at the Times. And this article came out that did the same thing, that was like, cis gay men led Stonewall. And a lot of people wrote in about this, and they issued this really passive-aggressive correction, which reads, this article referred incompletely to the initial protesters at the Stonewall Inn. They were primarily gay men, not just gay men, there was at least one lesbian involved, which is like, someone was having a bad day. And this correction, I got obsessed with the correction. And I sat by my inkjet printer because the New York Times also does a thing now where they write obituaries for people who are under-recognized or who have been ignored. And actually, 2 years before this happened, there was an obituary written about this person, Stormy DeLavrier, who was a mixed-race butch from New Orleans, a drag king who sang with the Jewel Box Revue at the Apollo Theater. She was the bouncer at Cubbyhole and Henrietta Hudson into like really old age, which are still 2 lesbian bars that exist in the West Village. She also took care of a lot of men who were dying of AIDS during the worst of the epidemic. By all accounts, she was extremely humble, extremely fierce, and just like took no BS. Also incredibly handsome. And so I wanted to visibilize Stormy, and I wanted to take her story and give her ghost some life, while also thinking about this kind of fighting about who was responsible for the Stonewall uprising. You know, I asked myself, why are people so obsessed with who threw the first brick or shot glass or high heel? Everyone will tell you a different story. And I wanted to understand why people were so attached and what the power struggles were around those stories. So I did a lot of research with microfiche in the New York Public Library. And do people know what microfiche is? Okay, everyone knows what microfiche is? No? Okay, I'm explaining microfiche. So microfiche are these transparencies that you get from the librarian, and they have newspaper articles and other text printed on them, and you put them under a magnifying, illuminating thing, and you can read the articles and print them out. But to look at them, you actually have to move around the transparency, so you actually don't get the complete story all at the same time. And this is a really interesting thing for me because it breaks up the narrative. And this is what I was also trying to do. I was trying to say, why did Stormy disappear? And why are we holding on to these narratives so much that disappear people? And so I basically made giant microfiche. I was asked by the Brooklyn Museum to make a piece for a show called Nobody Promised You Tomorrow, Contemporary Art 50 Years After Stonewall. And it starts with our correction. This article also referred incompletely to the initial protesters, and you can walk around the piece 360 degrees, and there are these excerpts of Stormy's life combined with these texts about narratives of Stonewall. It's actually an interview that Susan Stryker gave, and why those narratives and the arguments about narratives tell us so much about the makeup of queer community and the issues that are at play at that. It uses a lot of archival material, and then I also collaged of architecture from the West Village. And it actually has a 4-channel oscillator attached to it, so the light boxes, I don't have a video, but the light boxes flash and patterns, which lead you around the piece. So there's a lot of repetition. This piece is actually in the collection of the National Portrait Gallery now. It's in the new media collection, which has about 50 pieces. And it will be installed this summer for a year in the Struggle for Justice Gallery. And we're gonna see how that goes, because these boxes actually face a man who is running for president right now, and his portrait in the presidential library. So he gets the word lesbian flashed in his face over and over again, which I'm having a lot of feelings about because I just don't want him near my art. But I really enjoy making these light box pieces. I work with Light Bright Neon up in Kingston, New York, and they're basically family now. I have had a photography practice for quite a long time, since college, and I have like this entire photo collection of travel photography that I've taken. I do a lot of road trips, and that's what my work at Bowdoin has been, is looking at the queer road trip. But this was a piece I was commissioned to make for the Aldrich Museum of Contemporary Art. They did a show called 52 Artists, a feminist milestone. And I really wanted, the show basically brings 25 feminist artists who showed at the Aldrich in the 70s, and then 25 artists who are of a younger generation, and asking us to all make feminist work, and what does that look like these days? And I guess the first group of women was like not the most diverse, and they really wanted to kind of shake it up with people who were identifying as non-binary, who were queer people of color, you know, trying to get a larger sampling of art that was made today and what feminism might look like for a lot of different people. And the interesting thing about Ridgefield, Connecticut, if you've ever been there, is that there's stone walls everywhere, constant stone walls. And the Aldrich Museum actually sits on stone walls. So I was like, oh, I just made all this work about Stonewall, and now I'm in a place where there's actual stone walls. And I was thinking about how Stonewall was this big revolution and an uprising that had to happen and it was a major turning point in, you know, quote unquote gay liberation, but also things that are revolutionary are friendships and connections and these little day acts that get us through life. And coincidentally, I have a friend who lives in Ridgefield, Connecticut. And I met her when I was 13. She was my camp counselor at a weight loss camp in upstate New York that I was sent to without consent by my parents. And if you ever wanted to have like a really good time, all of the like fat kids that everyone picks on in middle school all put together in a summer camp, it's really fun. And like everyone has a great time, but kind of, because you don't really eat, but it's like, it's an experience. But my camp counselor, Julie, lives in Ridgefield, Connecticut now, and my nickname for her is my Great Gay Hope, because she was the first queer person I ever met. And she was 21, I was 13, and after camp, we had this great connection. She wrote me a letter every 6 weeks as a junior in college, just to kind of say, like, I support you, I'm here for you, and you're gonna be okay. And it absolutely saved my life as a 13-year-old, 100%. And so she lives down the road from the Aldrich, and I said, can I dig up your garden and put all the stones in your garden in the museum? And then I dug up the Aldrich's sculpture garden and took all of their rocks, and I put them together in this piece. So it's a combination of rocks from the Aldrich, stones from the Aldrich, and stones from Julie's garden, with this light box that has this building in Detroit, where I'm from, that someone has put spray painted dike onto. And then there's a little television embedded into the rocks. That's the other side. So there's a textile in there that's like covered in dirt. And I don't know if this is playing. Maybe I needed to make it play. There we go. And then my friend Nick Nas, who's in one of the embroideries, actually videoed me digging up the grounds of the Aldrich. So it was a really cool experience. I had a lot of fun making this piece, because a lot of the artists of the older generation that had work in the show did land art. And I've always been interested in feminist land art and women making land art. So this was me getting a really good workout. I spent 2 days digging out these stones. I also found a Karen Finley piece buried in the woods, which was a really strange experience that was about HIV, actually. But yeah, I'm real interested in expanding this body of work too. Nick Naz and I have plans to make a film of masculine spectrum people doing labor and work. So that's just a little excerpt of what plays in that little television that you see down there that looks like a stone. This is a really recent piece. It's a 2-foot embroidery of Brittany Griner. And one of the things about my art practice that has just been a kind of facet of it is that if there's an urgent issue, I will drop everything that I'm doing and just work on deal with the urgent issue. So when Roe versus Wade was overturned, like a lot of people, I had a complete meltdown and was full of rage, which is a great way to have a meltdown. And then Brittany Griner was detained in Russia, and I was also extremely upset about that. I'm a really big basketball fan, and so this year has been great, but lots of NCAA basketball and me screaming in my apartment. But I decided that I would make this embroidery of this picture that I found of her on the Phoenix Mercury Twitter wearing this sweatshirt that says abortion is healthcare. And there was something about the loss of bodily autonomy across the country and someone like Brittany Griner wearing that shirt who was detained in Russia, which for me was so much about her body, that really struck me as being incredibly, I guess I want to say poignant, but also just so fierce and brave and risky. And I was like, I'm going to get her out of jail. So, because I have a lawyer mom and lawyers are expensive. And I was like, I can make this piece. We're going to get some money for it. We're going to put it on display for visibility and pay the legal fees. And so I ended up making this embroidery, and thankfully she was released before this embroidery was done, because it took about 6 months of working all the time. And then the back of it, I don't have a detail shot, but I stitched her biography on the back of it, all these accomplishments. So this is a brand new piece, and we actually are in touch with her team, with her philanthropic team. So we're going to be able to take the funds and actually put them towards a queer youth organization in Phoenix. And I'm hoping that I get to go to a game also. They were like, we're going to bring you to a game. But yeah, this was like, I'll drop everything if something is upsetting me. It just has to be dealt with. I'm going to skip talking about this piece. And this is another recent Lightbox work. It was installed, again, I'm like having a lot of fun with site-specific installation, again, working outside, but it's also a Lightbox that was installed in Joshua Tree, California in November. And next week I'm going to install it outside of a gallery in upstate New York. But again, it's like about this new body of work that I've been making at Bowdoin, considering these kind of queer road trips in the infinite. For me, like you can see the Felix Gonzalez-Torres influence, and I forgot to say, the Lightbox piece that's at the Brooklyn Museum of Stormy, that's at the National Portrait Gallery, is actually wired with Untitled America wire that was used in the restoration of those light bulb pieces for Felix Gonzalez-Torres. And right after the Lightbox pieces of Stormy at Stonewall go up at the National Portrait Gallery, they'll open a Felix Gonzalez-Torres exhibit with Untitled America light bulbs. So the wiring for those light bulbs of Felix Gonzalez-Torres is also in my piece that's going to be up. And it was all done by Light Bright Neon. So there's like this beautiful special connection. But again, yeah, this was kind of a new piece of travel photography. This was all taken during the COVID pandemic. I spent a lot of time in the car with my partner driving across the country back and forth. And here's another one. This is actually a print that we made last year, edition of 5, of Ziggy and Sparky under Perfect Lovers. So I'll end with that. Thank you very much. And if you'd like to ask questions, you can come up to the mic. I'm supposed to say that, these mics.
LJ, thank you for an absolutely amazing talk. You've given us so much to think about, and I really appreciate that. There was an observation that you made on a few occasions that I wanted to ask you about, and it has to do with the making of some of your large textile pieces. You pointed out that these were works that were made with, and I'll just say, quote, toys, because we think of toys as something that don't produce, but obviously these were sort of toy machines that were producing. And I was interested to know whether, from a metaphorical standpoint or for other reasons, it was important that these machines that you were using also masqueraded as toys, or whether any knitting machine would have done, whether there was something special about the fact that this was marketed at young people. So thank you.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it actually gets me to talk about something I usually talk about and didn't talk about, which are that a lot of the work I make, it has to be very accessible for me, and it also has to be able to pack up easily, and it's like affordable, and I am someone who has to be making all the time, like literally every hour of the day pretty much, which is why I carry the embroideries around. So having things like toys that I can buy off the internet, you know, for me, the accessibility of that really mirrors my experience as a queer person. And having things that I can pack up easily, like a lot of my experience as a queer person has been a nomadism that's either by choice or that's been forced. And you know, growing up without the internet, you got in the car to go to the gay bar. That's like how you met people. So being able to take everything with me, those huge quilts that are like 20 by 14, I brought it up in the car to Bowdoin to work on. It's like I smashed conservators. I'm a conservator's nightmare. But you know, having things that are easy to access, easy to take with me, easy to make things, and you know, a cool cord or a Barbie knitting machine certainly fits the bill. But there's also a commentary on craft where people are very obsessed with mastery, right? And for me, this is a way to say, I'm making some of the most intricate work that I can think of making, but I'm also doing it with like a toy you can buy off the internet. You know, to make a fence that's the size of a Richard Serra with a toy is like for me, that was a really interesting thing in grad school to think about, where, you know, I don't have the access to like a way to make a giant piece of steel, but I can knit it. And, you know, I think that that's a little bit of a flattened comparison, but for me in grad school, it was something that I thought about a lot. And so, you know, and I think it's like a little funny, you know, for someone who appears very masculine to be using like Barbie knitting machines. I'm actually not that masculine, but like extremely femme. But, you know, to have these like sparkly toy machines that I'm making this work that actually does cover like extremely serious issues. And the piece I'm making at Bowdoin that has to do with, you know, queer and trans auto mechanic shops from the 1970s to the present, you know, I think looking at a lot of the work, you're like, oh, these are really joyous, queer, you know, communities coming together. But there's a lot of darkness there too. And, you know, part of what I'm thinking about with the roadmap is that we're having to get into cars and go over state lines to get health services. A lot of different kinds of people are. And I've had friends that relocated last summer so that they can get their kids health care. You know, I'm a news junkie, so I listen to a lot of stories about people having to travel to get abortions. And so I think about that in relationship to like having to get everything in the car with me or anything that's accessible. You know, I think there's like a lot of layers layers to that. So while it seems fun, there's also like a very practical reason, and that practicality also comes off like because of systemic and sometimes like, very present violent circumstances that people have. So I think that it exists on many different levels to make work in this way.
Coming over from this side. I want to ask you a question about friendship, but I don't know the question that I quite want to ask yet, so I'll enter into it sort of in this way. So one of the things that really struck me in your talk and our picnic table conversations this fall is this notion of carrying your friends with you by literally making and remaking their image as you're traveling from place to place, and hearing about, that first picture, 1995, this year I graduated from high school, but we're similar age, seeing that visual, and then the camp experience. I think friendships in these like formative teenage years shape so much of who we become, either what we are or what we're working against in that time period. And in making all of these relationships visible, you make friendship as, among the most important relationships that we can have in our lives more visible. Can you just talk about why that's important to you?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, actually. I have a friend who's working on a book right now that's called Friendship is a Way of Life, and I'm very excited for it to come out. But I think that there was something that was really interesting that you said. Oh, it's about our ages. So I think that there's a big part of me that recently has felt like, even more than my gender and sexuality, a lot of my queerness is rooted in these kinship networks that are non-biological, though I am considering that biological family networks can be very queer, not based on like DNA or anything. I have a lot of thoughts about that, but I'm coming around to it in this, trying to think through it. And those networks are absolutely critical they have kept me alive, hands down. Like medical stuff, emotional support, hands down. But the other thing that's been very interesting in terms of you saying, like, I saw the AIDS quilt, is that for people, I think our age, who grew up in a time where, when I was in sex ed, there was like nothing about any kind of like gender or sexuality that I could relate to, except the fact that I was probably going to get AIDS, which I'm at very low risk for getting HIV, but that's not how it was explained to me at the time in 1993. Like there was a false, not false, but like it wasn't explained properly, because who was going to explain it properly at that time? I think that the generation that I belong to, a lot of my friends who are my age or older, grew up in a time where, people were traumatized, obviously. We're growing up in a time where gender and sexuality is not accepted. And a lot of my friends have been made through the HIV and AIDS community, particularly through my involvement with visual aids, which Bowdoin did a workshop in the fall where they made postcards for their big benefit that's called Postcards from the Edge. And part of what is, besides my own experiences with HIV and AIDS, which are deeply personal and also political and exist on a lot of different levels, the way that my queer kinship life exists now is that people my age who have grown up during the epidemic are now becoming caregivers for older people who are living with HIV, but now not dying of HIV because of all of the medical technologies that exist. It kind of goes into like this deep dive of the past 3 years, but I'm like, how do we being this generation as friends who are taking care of each other and also taking care of like an intergenerational community. Like we need a toolkit for taking care of each other at this time. But those are the care networks that feel like make up, I guess, like my whole heart pretty much. And I feel like that's like a cheesy way to explain it, but it's true. And, you know, Frederick Weston, who was in one of the embroideries, he was like my closest friend in New York. And I learned a lot about caregiving when he was dying. And that care went both ways towards me as well. Like, as much as I was taking care of him, he was taking care of me. And I feel really lucky that despite the fact that like there's so much darkness about that, those are the people I have a lot of fun with too. Like we go dancing, or we used to go, I don't think I've danced since before the pandemic, but I should go again. I'm ready. And I dance in my kitchen a lot, and with my dogs and with Jay. But yeah, it's like, I feel so lucky. And I also think that like, if you think about that, like we call it fat camp, like that fat camp story, and also HIV and AIDS, it's like a lot of outcasts coming together. And for me, that's been the most vibrant, gorgeous, beautiful, those are like the beautiful experience. Like it's the weirdos of the world that really make me feel, I guess, like at home, because home's not a place for me. It's like, despite the fact that I'm like, here's these queer houses. Most of those houses don't exist anymore, but the people do.
So I think it's really interesting, like hearing about your background, like in literary studies and English, and like your approach towards like text and like queering language and narratives, and also like reclamation, especially of slurs. So I don't know, I'm just interested to hear about how you like subvert conventions of language, whether that's making up new words, and how you see like the material and the textual working together. Yeah.
That's a great
Just
question.
to elaborate
Thanks,
on that,
Lisa.
because I know you've already talked about it.
Yeah, it's like a really great question. So for me, I think that I love language and I love words and playing with words. And I think that words are so freeing, and then they also have limitations, right? So when we describe ourselves, you know, as one thing or another, we're able to understand things, but then it's also got this like limit on it. So for instance, like when there's a creation of a new language, like the Van language, for me, there's like a transcendence of the ways that we're used to communicating, and we have new ways of communicating. And that's, I think, really reflective of my experience, you know, understanding the world at large. And I always feel really grateful to students, because I feel like from them, I get updates on language that are really helpful to me. I had one student make this entire glossary of terms about gender, and I was like, I don't know this, and I don't know this, and I don't know this, but Generation Z is about to tell me what I am. And it totally worked. It was great. You know, I think that it's a little bit of, like, using language is a little bit of me trying to give back as well, because the first things I think that gave me hope in the world were books. And reading, like I said, Toni Morrison Sula, and books by Dorothy Allison, June Jordan. You know, the books I read now, though I don't get to read much because I'm just embroidering 24 hours a day right now. It's like actually true. But you know, I think that there's like trying to, for me, understand language, to expand language, and then also to try and give back to so many writers that have really changed my life and rocked my world and made me feel things that I didn't know I could feel, like poetry, reading poetry. I wish I read more poetry because I feel like from poems, they can like completely change the makeup of my biology sometimes. So, you know, if we're able to transform language in that way, are we able to transform ourselves? And I think that that's like a question that happens in the light boxes too, because those are all New York Times articles collaged together to tell a completely different story than any of those New York Times articles told. You know, it was collaging together those stories to create a different kind of archive, and one that didn't tell a complete story, because no story, I think, is ever totally complete. And so, you know, language is a tool, which, you know, the van has the language on the tools.
Well, LJ, thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much. This is.
And I just want to underline your comment that the story is never really complete, because I feel like that is an invitation to continue conversations with you. We look forward to welcoming you back many more times
I
to
hope so.
Bowdoin. Halley and Michael, thank you so much for making this program possible, and thank you, LJ, for
Thank you.
creating such a beautiful evening for us.
Thanks.